Hi, I'm John DeDakis, and you're one-to-one with me. And I'm one-to-one with Carol Costello, my old pal, Carol Costello. From our days together, I used to tell people I used to spend the night with you every night at CNN. Because I don't know, what time did our show come on the air? 5 in the morning or something like that.
5 in the morning. Yeah,
5 in the morning. And this is my my daybreak mug that still exists.
I love that so much.
I know. Although I have to admit, full disclosure, milk is in here, not coffee this time. So
yeah.
Anyway,
we've both gotten
Carol,
older.
It's great to see you. How are you?
I'm great. I'm living in Los Angeles now with my husband, and that's a first for me, by the way. So I have because when I worked at CNN, I lived apart from my husband. So for 18 years, we really didn't live together. So now that I am, it feels like we're newlyweds, and I feel like I have a life, and I'm pretty damn happy about that.
Is that his guitar behind you?
That is his guitar. One of the charming things about my husband is he can play a mean guitar, and he can be very romantic with it. So it's nice.
Oh my. Well, and he also went to the Berklee School of Music, correct?
He did for 1 year. He did. He went to the Berklee School of Music. He actually graduated from Princeton. He's a mathematician, and he's president now of Loyola Marymount University, which is why we're in Los Angeles, really.
Exactly. And he also does the music for your new podcast.
Yes, that was an agonizing process, but yes. Because he did like a lot of versions, like a lot of different musical tunes, and most of them I didn't like. And I had to tell him that. And, you know, when you tell someone you love you don't like something, everything's very honest and out in the open. So sometimes it would create these huge fights, but I think we settled on a tune that we both like and I think is effective.
Okay. What I'd like to do, and you'll appreciate this, Carol, this interview program is a very low budget operation. I book the guests. I'm the executive producer. I do the fonts. What else do I do? Oh, I'm also going to roll the video. It's actually not even a video. I'm going to see if I can do this, because this is the intro that you taped for your podcast, which I think will let it speak for itself, and then we'll discuss it. Let me just make sure that I can do this right. I'm going to share the screen. Hold it. Stop the sharing. Now I'm going to share the screen. I'm talking out loud. This is so
I'm learning along with you, John.
It's so unprofessional. All right. Stand by to roll tape, and share. And listen.
I hate your generation.
Hey everyone, I'm Carol Costello. I'm back on my own terms, and it feels right. I left CNN a few years ago after 18 years. I loved my time there, but I'd been ready to move on for years. I just never had the guts to do something that's mine until now. I bopped around for a time after CNN. I tried HLN. It didn't work out there. I'm just not into true crime all the time. Then I tried teaching journalism at LMU, and I liked it. I developed a class on how to ease the political divide in America. You know, civility, restoring civility to our nation. And I liked it. Out of that class, this podcast was born. Like so many other unnecessarily nasty divisions, the divide between generations seems unhealthy to me. Like, boomers just die already? Xers, racist Karens, millennials, entitled brats, and Gen Z, ungrateful TikTokers? Isn't it time we talked through our issues civilly? Isn't it time we actually learned from one another? Because I've learned a lot from my students lately. So this podcast, I Hate Your Generation, is co-produced by LMU students, edited by an LMU grad. And yeah, it feels right. So sit back and enjoy some provocative civil conversation between people from different generations. 10-minute conversations that explore why we hate one another and why we love one another. The goal is simple. We all have to work together to restore civility. This podcast, it's my small way of healing the rift. I hope you enjoy it.
Nice.
Thank
So,
you.
tell me more about where the idea came from, what it's like to produce it and work with your students.
Well, I'm from Ohio, and I'm now living in California, in Los Angeles, in a coastal city. I moved here from New York City, another coastal city, and I couldn't help but notice how people on the coast feel about Midwesterners. I've had people say to my face that Midwesterners are uneducated, stupid, rednecky, um, not knowing that I was from Ohio, of course, but once I told them, it's like they were embarrassed and kind of slunk away. So that really bothered me because I think that Americans rarely get to know their fellow Americans who live in other parts of the country. So I decided to develop a class at Loyola Marymount University called Project Citizen. And I worked with my alma mater, Kent State in Ohio. And the premise is simple. We take 6 students from LMU and 6 students from Kent State University, red state, blue state. We put them together physically in one classroom, and we split our time between Los Angeles and Cleveland, Ohio, so the students can actually get to know one another, to explore their differences, and most importantly, explore the ways they're the same. After 6 weeks, John, I'm telling you, those students, it changed their lives. And it changed my life too, because I watched the process, right? Because we all hold stereotypes of one another. And even though they're 19 and 20 and 21 years old, they hold the same stereotypes we do of one another. But once they got, I mean, there were people cried in class, they became emotional because we talked about really heavy stuff. Like, what does divide us as Americans? Is it the media? That's a simple answer, right? Is it religion? Is it politics? What is it exactly? And where do we learn those stereotypes? At what age? When does that happen? So the classes were very emotional. So they learned along the way, and I learned along the way, and it changed something inside of me.
What would you think would be the biggest thing that you learned?
That the younger generation is special. They are special. And I truly believe that they will find a better way. I'm perfectly comfortable leaving the country in their hands. They will do just fine. I can't wait until the older generation is out of the way so they can do their thing. I know that sounds terrible, but
how did your attitudes toward the younger generation change based on this experience?
well, I don't have children. So, the young people that I know, I worked with at CNN, right? So I knew them on a professional level, but I didn't really know them. I held the same stereotypes of young people as everyone else, like millennials, how stupid, like they eat tofu and like whatever, right? Or Gen Zers like always on TikTok and they're like always on the, like I had that same impression of young people, that they weren't hardworking, right? That they put everyone down because they were entitled. But I did not find that was the case at all, at least with my students from Kent State and from LMU. They were hardworking, smart, open-minded people, and
now
made me happy.
in terms of journalism and in terms of consuming information and where we become informed, what's been your experience in terms of where these kids get their news? Because things have changed a lot since you and I were starting our careers.
They don't watch CNN. They don't watch Fox. They don't watch MSNBC. They don't watch ABC, CBS, or NBC Evening News. They get their information from a variety of different sources, mostly from social media. A lot of them get their news from Twitter, like little tiny headlines, right? A lot of them get their news from shared social media. So they live in their bubbles too, right? Which is not good.
Well, I was going to say, is this troubling to you that their news consuming habits are so, I don't know, arguably superficial?
Yes and no, because they're aware of that in a way that I think adults are not. Like, I think a lot of people our age get their news that way, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we never venture out. we don't realize that we're getting select information that appeals to us, and we buy into it without thinking because we're kind of lazy, right? I think young people know that. They're very much aware of that. And I hope that I noticed in them that knowledge will prompt them to find other sources of news with differing opinions so they can put it all together and come to one conclusion.
Now, when you and I started out in the business, there were no cell phones. I mean, it was probably film. It was film when I started out, so it wasn't even videotape, not to mention really live. There was no internet. And now anybody with a cell phone and a send button is a publisher, which means there's no editorial oversight. So how do you go about teaching your students to be discerning news consumers?
That's tough. It's really tough. You know, I always tell them, first off, if a network or news source apologizes for its mistakes, then you know it's pretty responsible, right? If it's long established as a trustable source of news, like CNN is, like CBS News or NBC News or ABC News, you pretty much know that that's a credible source. You know, like the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or the Washington Post, the Washington Times, Time Magazine. Like, they've been around for a long time, and you can't be irresponsible and not factual and survive. And I think that, secondly, they have to understand that Fox and MSNBC are total opinion shows. Even their, you know, even in the afternoon when you see their news, it's slanted, right? And they have to understand that that's what that is. And that's difficult because when you watch it, it looks the same, right? Looks the same. And you could argue, I'm not like giving CNN a free pass by any means.
Well,
you could argue
in
prime time that some of their shows seem a little opinionated, right? Not necessarily news shows.
Yeah, I mean, I retired from CNN in 2013, and you stayed on a little longer than that. So my question is, and it was already starting to change when I was there. In your opinion, how has CNN changed from when you first started there, which I think was not long after 9/11, and you left how long ago?
2 years ago. 2 years
Okay,
ago.
so how has it evolved to where it is now? From,
well,
you know, how would you?
I don't know if you remember this, but when we covered the Iraq War, right? We were not allowed to use the term "our forces." We had to use American forces. I don't think that would be true today at CNN.
Right. Same with foreign. Ted Turner actually instigated a $50 fine if anybody used the word foreign, because he said, we're an international news organization. Foreign to whom? So the word international was used instead.
That's right. That was in place when I started after 9/11. You know, I can remember viewers would get really upset when I'd say American troops and not our troops, us, you know, use those kinds of terms. They called me a traitor, and it really upset me. But I was a journalist, and I could understand why, because you're supposed to be covering the war like a journalist, not as a patriot, not as an American, but a journalist. And that's my job, right? I have to be as objective as I can with what I see. I can't let my patriotism or my love of country color what I say on the air. So I understood that.
And yet your dad was a Marine drill sergeant. Am I right?
Yes, he was. Yeah, definitely. And, you know, I still cry during the national anthem, even now, and I'm a little ashamed of my country for certain things.
Right.
So that is a very difficult thing to do, but I did it and I understood it. But when I left CNN, it was not like that. And I don't think that CNN would have a problem with my saying our troops or us or using terms like that.
Are you, if you're like I am, I don't really get my news from television. I get my news from really Washington Post, New York Times, AP, Reuters, National Public Radio, I still think that's a credible, broadcast news outlet. Are you and I on the same page there?
You and I are on the same page. Occasionally, I'll watch Aaron Burnett's show because I really like Aaron Burnett, quite frankly.
Yeah.
But I think that, and I still think CNN is a wonderful organization, and I would never want to say anything horrible about CNN.
Right.
But certain shows, I just want the news. I don't want the panels, and I don't want the yelling, and I just don't want it anymore, because it's part of the reason I wanted to leave. I want to tell stories about people's lives. I don't want to, argue over a single point for an hour with different people. That got really tiresome to me. After a time, it's like, I get it. Let's move on. But people watch. So, for me to sit here and criticize, like,
but it's ratings.
Because their ratings are like huge.
There you go. There you go. What about the concept of objectivity? Is that dead?
I actually think objectivity is difficult. Like, in class, I talk about this all the time. How can we make news a more trustworthy source? How can that be? And part of me says, be honest with the audience about what you believe, right? So if I say, I'm a Democrat and I voted Democrat, or I'm a Republican and I voted Republican, I just want to preface that. I want you to know where I'm coming from, because I'm going to try to be as objective as I can, but this is who I am. And I just want you to have that information so that as you listen to what I say, that can be in your mind. And then you can take away from it what you want. Like, a part of me says that's what journalists should do now, instead of being so, I can't say anything about myself or what I voted for or who I voted for or whatever. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure that would work. But a part of me, like 75%, says that's the right road, because we've come too far now. You can't go back. You can't go back to doing the news like PBS, right?
PBS.
Because you do have to make money. Yeah. News is a business, right?
Right.
I mean, if nobody watches, what good is it?
Let's stop here for a second and go back in time. Tell us a little bit about your career. How did you get into journalism? Why did you get into journalism? And, what were the stops along the way?
I wanted to be a journalist ever since I was 12. Okay. There was a woman on television named Jessica Savage at the time, and I thought she was the bomb.
Yeah.
I really liked her because she was one of the few women who broadcast on a national news network. And she got to tell people incredible things. She got to be in the middle of things. She got to be in the middle of history. She got to go out and change the world. I very much got in it because I wanted to change the world. And you still can change the world as a journalist, in small ways and in huge ways. But that's what kept me in journalism for 32 years. I started when I was 19.
And was it always broadcast? It was always broadcast?
Yes. Always broadcast. Always broadcast.
And didn't you tell me you were 19 when you got your first job?
Yes, 19.
You still look 19, Carol.
I wish.
And you covered cops and courts?
Yes, I always covered crime for some reason, until crime and politics. Those are my two beats.
And where were the places you worked?
I worked in Akron, Ohio, and then I went to Toledo, and then I went to Columbus, Ohio, and then I went to Baltimore, Maryland, then I went to Washington, D.C., and then I went to CNN.
Okay, I'm moving.
So it always went up.
Were there times when you had, obviously the term fake news is more in play now, but did you have to deal with anger from viewers, and even to the point where you felt your life was in danger in the field?
I mean, I got my share of death threats. Mostly it was rape threat. They threatened to rape you or kill your husband or stuff like that. A few times I had to have security watch me leave the building and enter the building. But I never really felt that those threats were serious. I just think that that's what people do now. And it's really sad. It's like you can't just say, I think you're wrong and I'm not going to watch you anymore. It's like, I'm going to kill your family. Or they want to scare you. They want to control you that way because America's become so vicious. A part of America has. So I try not to let that intrude upon my life and control me because that just pisses me off.
I mean, is part of it, is much of this an anti-woman influence, or is it anti-journalist, or both?
I think it's both. I do think it's both. I think men get their share of death threats too. Maybe not the rape part, but yeah, it's just the way people act now. There's no filter. There's no nothing. It's just that's the way you fight back. You have to scare people into thinking as you believe. You have to frighten them, and that's really pathetic.
Let's get back to the teaching thing for a second, because I mean, I did some journalism teaching at the University of Maryland as well, and in my experience, it was mostly women who were taking the classes. And I don't know if that's the case at Loyola as well. But my question then is, how do you approach the whole issue of the MeToo movement, especially in newsrooms? Because there have been plenty of amazing falls from grace by men in broadcast journalism, and all across a lot of different disciplines. But how do you go about teaching your students about how to navigate those treacherous shoals in a newsroom? Use both sides of the page if necessary.
Yeah, I just think it's still difficult. I think to myself, because early in my career, I was sexually harassed and I was fired because I wouldn't have sex with my general manager. I was 23 or 4 at the time. I never told anybody. And I think, what would I do today? Would I do anything different? Would I tell someone? Would I go to the HR? Would I go to HR, Human Resources? Mm-hmm. I can unequivocally say, no, I would not go to HR. I just wouldn't.
Why not? Why?
Because they work for the company. I wouldn't trust them. So I would, maybe today, I would hire a lawyer. But all those women who were fired from Fox, and there were those huge settlements, right? None of those women are working today. So it's still really hard to navigate. It's really hard to counsel someone what to do, because you have to be willing to give up so much still if you want to do something about it.
It sounds to me like, in spite of the Me Too movement, not a lot has changed, or has it?
No, I think a lot has changed, because I think that the fear of God has been put into male managers, because I think that women are not afraid to speak up, right? At some point in time, they're going to speak up. So I do think that times have changed. It won't really change until we have more female managers, more females in upper management. Then it'll truly change.
What's your take? Have any of your students covered any of Trump's rallies or anything like that?
Oh, they did that a lot in my Project Citizen course.
Well, tell us about that. I'm sure that I would like to especially know what it's. I mean, we know that he basically hates journalism, hates journalists, enemies of the American people. I have friends who've had to be, have a police escort away from the Trump rally to their vehicle. It's that nasty. What's it like for your students to be on the receiving end of that kind of vitriol?
It's the best education they got at LMU. Um, they covered a lot of Trump rallies when they were in my class as journalists, as student journalists. So they had their cameras and their little press passes, right? And the moment the rally goers noticed the cameras over the students' shoulders, they started to say fake news and hurl, not so nice things at these young people. I remember one of my students, Gabby, she's 20. She said somebody got right into her face and started saying, fake news, fake news. She just burst into tears and she ran off and she went into a coffee shop and she just started crying. And she said she's sitting in there and she's crying and crying and she's looking out and her fellow student journalists are still out there covering the rally. And she said to herself, either I can sit in this coffee shop and I can cry, or I can go back out there and I can try again in a different way. And she decided on the latter. She went out and she engaged one of the Trump demonstrators or rally goers. And she said, I just engaged them as a human being. And we talked. And I realized that he kind of had the same problems everybody does. He's worried about not having enough money to send his kid to college. And she said, we had a really nice conversation. And I get it. And I thought that was the best kind of learning experience a student can have in college, if you want to be a working journalist, right? You have to learn to engage people, even if they're hostile to you at first. It's your job to do that, to be professional, to go out there and give it a go. And she did.
One of the things that I'm experiencing in social media is the difficulty it is to find common ground. Because, and I'm, here's the struggle. It's almost as if, I don't know if you've experienced this, but it's almost like engaging with someone is sort of like trying to hurl a rhetorical artillery shell into the enemy camp and expecting that it was going to blow up and then magically change their mind. It doesn't work that way. And what's maddening is when someone isn't really listening to the facts, they're just spouting their dogma. So what's your advice for me and people I love? How can we engage in a way that is going to find that common ground? Is it even possible?
I don't think it's possible with some people, but I think that's a very small minority. I don't think that's everybody. I don't think that's the majority of people. I just like to use kindness, right? So it's more like just, I tell them right off the bat, like, that's not true and here's why. Mm-hmm. But I'm open to listening to you as to why you want to continue this kind of conversation. I'm open. And I even say, I just want to have a civil conversation with you. And I understand it if you can't. I totally get it. But I will not have a nasty, profanity-filled convo with you online, because that gets us nowhere.
Right.
I just find that kind of stuff is more effective in engaging people. That's not to say that they'll ever agree with me, because they probably won't, but that's okay. It's America.
Yeah. I like this idea of civility, and it's interesting that the podcast, your podcast from yesterday, dealt with the F-bomb. It was a great. I never heard you say it once, but you really tell us about that podcast, because I think that was the epitome of what we're talking about right now.
Well, I was having this conversation with Larry Sabato, who runs the Center for Politics at the University of Virginia. And in the course of our conversation, we were talking about how best to restore civility in America. And he says, people have to stop using the F word. He said, I never say it because it coarsens the conversation. Even if you mean it in a nice way. Like, this is fucking great. He goes, even if you mean it like that, right? It just coarsens the conversation. And it doesn't invite you in. It keeps you out. And I found that so intriguing because, I don't know, if you walk around the streets of Los Angeles or New York, you hear it constantly from people. It's every other word. And you become so used to it that the F word is no longer profanity. It's just another word.
But your students don't see it that way.
Well, they do and they don't, right? So they use it in conversation. They'll use it at protests. But they don't want to admit that they think it's just another word, right? So it's really complicated. Some students love to hurl the word because they feel it's still powerful in that 60s hippie kind of way, right? Like F the police, right? They like to do that to anger the police, to create some sort of tension. And they think that that's the best way. But is it? I mean, is it? Is that more effective than chanting George Floyd or lying down in the street? What is more effective? And, these are questions that intrigue me because I do believe we use the word too much. And
by using it as much as it loses its effectiveness, right?
And words matter. Words matter. Civility is hard, right? Words matter. I mean, it's easy to listen to someone who doesn't agree with you and say, "Oh, fuck you," right? Or, right?
Right.
But it's harder to listen, right? Or it's seemingly harder. It's really not. But it takes time. We're frustrated and we want things right now as Americans. We don't want to stand and listen to someone. That's so important. You can't be civil without listening. You just can't.
Right. I had a conversation with a woman in Suffolk, Virginia about fake news, and she was going off on me. And I asked her, "Where do you get your news?" And she said, "Breitbart." And my jaw dropped. And before I could even say anything, she said, "Well, I have to have my opinion reinforced." And I said, actually, you need to have your opinion informed, and then you can go wherever you want with it. But you got to have some sort of reliable fact base in order to make up your mind.
I know, but those kinds of people, I think I don't think you can change their minds. I just don't think so.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's some people whose minds are closed. Let's talk about editors. I was I was your editor at one time. What was my nickname again?
We nicknamed John Satan because you spent all this time writing this beautiful story and you want to use certain words to really drive your point home, and Satan would get his little claws in there and he would change it. I would be so mad at him. Oh, I remember being so mad at you, John. But in retrospect,
Brian Bell, the executive producer, I think he's the one who coined the name, and he talked about my cloven hooves.
Right, exactly. He goes, "Let's run it by Satan."
But but tell me the transition. There's a good story. There's a good outcome here, right?
We were required at CNN to go through the row or copy editors like John, and they had a lot of them on staff. And it was the most onerous process. It really was, because you really would spend all day. You were out in the field, you were interviewing people, you did all this research. You knew the story better than this person ever was going to, right? Because John wasn't out there. But so, my whole time at CNN, I had this weird relationship with the row. But after the fact, always, I think that it's so important to have someone who's not connected to the story reading it, who can ask questions that you might not have thought of, or who can say, "Are you sure this is right? Let me double check this statistic for you. Just let me double check," right? And, most times I was right, but there were times I wasn't, right? And that saved me from myself. Because I don't want to be wrong. I don't do fake news. I don't want to be wrong. You could argue my stories are biased. That's your prerogative. But I don't tell untruths. Well, I don't do fake news.
The thing I noticed as an editor, my job was to check for accuracy. Accuracy was job one. Clunky writing or dropped words. You know that you didn't always have a chance to read a script ahead of time. Sometimes it pops up in the prompter, and that's the first time you see it. And there was one copy, one script I got. It said the winds of the tornado were so strong they suckled the shirt right off his back. Now I know you're smart. You would not have read it that way. You think when you read this at the same time. But if there's a gazillion, if somebody's talking in your ear at the same time, you might have just said it because it was there. And so that's one of the things I'm guarding against. One of the things I was supposed to guard against, in addition to the spelling of the fonts on the screen, you'll notice you are now identified as an official friend of John DeDakis.
Awesome.
But misspellings was a problem, but also bias. And the interesting thing is, in my 25 years at CNN, it was rare that I came across biased copy. Now, every now and then you could criticize a word choice, which may have been it could have been inadvertently taken as bias. And so I would protect against that. But I can count on 2 fingers the conversations I had with writers about actually biased copy.
Well, it's interesting you say that because, I teach that in class about, and also a false equivalency, right? Because for a time.
Explain that.
False equivalency. So let's take climate change. That's easy, right?
Mm-hmm.
The vast majority of scientists, 99 point, I don't know, it's 97 to 99%, say climate change is happening. The world is getting hotter and we got to do something about it. So I'm writing a story about that. Do I give equal time to that 3% who don't think climate change is happening?
It would almost be the same as doing a story on a moonshot and then going to someone from the Flat Earth Society for an opposing point of view. It's an artificial opposing point of view. I think that's what you're saying, right?
Yeah. So I always refuse to. I mentioned the 3%, and a lot of that is because of political reasons, right? So I think for a long time, news organizations felt they had to present both sides because there was so much pressure, and people accused you of being biased because you didn't really give equal time to that tiny sliver of people who believed climate change isn't real. But that's a false equivalency. Mm-hmm. It just is. And it's logic, right? It's logical. But logic doesn't often go over in the public forum, right? Especially if you really don't want to believe that that's happening, right? You don't want to believe that because you hear from whomever in your bubble, right? They keep saying that, right? But my job as a journalist is not to appease you in your bubble.
Exactly.
It's to tell
people can think it's a biased story only because their point of view isn't slavishly reproduced there.
Right. If I can which I can't, I have to as a journalist, I have to back up my story with facts, right? If I can do that, then I really don't owe that tiny sliver of one person out there or 3 people out there who believe, you know what I mean? I'm generalizing and exaggerating, but you understand what I mean? It's like doing a story on aliens. They wanted me to do a story on aliens once at CNN. I remember that. And I refused to do it because unless you provide me absolute complete proof and not from some nutty person, I'm not going to do a story on that.
Well, what was the take?
Creationism. That's another good one. Creationism.
Oh man, yeah. There's a can of worms for you.
That's right. So, I'm sorry, dinosaurs did not live at the same time as Jesus. Right? You have science to back that up. So why should I do a story on creationism when that's it's just not scientifically approved, right? So that would be a false equivalence to say.
Well, maybe not. I mean, it's debatable. I mean, it's
not debatable.
There are seminaries that talk about creation. I mean, it's religious dogma.
It is not true. Dinosaurs did not live when Jesus lived. I talked to a creationist once and asked him how that was possible because the dinosaurs would have had to be on Noah's Ark, and wouldn't that have been hard? Dinosaurs speak. He said they were baby dinosaurs.
I'm
out.
Where are you? Let me ask you this before we run out of time. Are you optimistic about journalism going forward?
I'm scared
Why?
because so many small newspapers are going under. So many areas of our country aren't covered by journalists, and that's a scary thing. And unless we figure that out, it's just, I don't want to say we're doomed, but all news is really local, right? Local news is really important. Like what's happening in your backyard affects you the most. We all can't just listen to cable news all day because that's national, right? It doesn't directly affect your lives, right? But what happens in your local governments, in your city council, in your mayor's office, in your police department, that really does affect your life. And it really does need a watchdog. Because, I don't know, it really concerns me. I think that, frankly, it's up to universities to figure that out. I think that they should give their resources of young journalists to cover local communities in those places that are news deserts. I do.
And what is the responsibility of the individual news consumer, the person with the cell phone, who pushes send over a juicy post that they have no idea is true or not, but it sounds great. What is our responsibility just as citizens in terms of telling?
Here's what I tell
people
my
what's true and
students.
not?
This is what I tell my students. We all have big platforms now, right? I mean, CNN has a huge platform, but you have a big platform too, right? Thousands of people, though. And that's thousands of people, right, on Facebook, because it goes, right? It multiplies very quickly. With every big platform comes responsibility. You have the power to hurt someone, to affect their lives negatively or positively, right? You have to keep that in mind. You have to start caring about the other person. It can't just be about you, right? We need to start acting like we have souls again, like we have hearts, big hearts. With any platform comes responsibility. And if you always think about that, you will make the right choice.
Oh, Carol, this is, you never talked like this when we worked together. This is wonderful. You've come a long way.
Thanks, John.
This has been so much fun, and I hope people get a chance. How can people find your podcast?
Wherever you subscribe to your podcast,
And
you can find I Hate Your Generation.
All right, hold on.
Apple, Spotify, Stitcher.
Yeah. Okay, so
I
what
Hate
they
Your
would do is
Generation.
type in the name of the show.
And it'll come up.
Okay.
Yes,
Excellent.
please do, and subscribe, because I'm really excited about it. I think there are 5 episodes on there now. So.
Right, five or six, and your students and former students produce it and edit it, and you write it, I guess. But it's nice and bite sized. I mean, it's like 15 minutes, and it's very listenable and thought provoking. So I encourage people to to listen to this. Carol, it's been wonderful.
Thank you. Mwah.
Love you.
Love you too.
Okay, I'm John DeDakis. We've been one-to-one with Carol Costello. Thanks, Carol.